In the world that we live in, it is not only easy, but commonplace to live a life that is separate from God. Now, this is not something I'm too worried about as a Christian because it's very clear in Revelations that end times are going to look like this. But if you're watching this video, you're not one of those people. I've actually noticed something that's been quite encouraging. I don't know about you, but in the last couple of years, I've noticed that there's a revival in like the young generation, particularly in our generation, right? Like I'm 21, turning 22. I'd say for like the age group of like 16 to 24, there has been quite the revival in like young people who don't want the life that this world offers. They don't want to live a life that's separate from God. They don't want to live a degenerate life. It first started with self-improvement, right? It started with a lot of like the young men getting onto self-improvement because, like life was just miserable. So guys wanted to get onto self-improvement, right? And then, you had your people like Jordan Peterson has been incredible. He's definitely been incredible for my Christian faith, right? Like he's been incredible for helping me strengthen my relationship with God, right? Because there's like an intellectual, right? Because obviously for us as Christians, when the world makes us feel like, like, oh, you're delusional, like you don't know what you're talking about or whatever. And then when you have someone like Jordan Peterson come and really put into words what you've been thinking, right? It gives you a stronger faith, and not just like in terms of your faith in Christianity, but just in general as like a young man. And I believe that's why he became so popular. I know that's why I loved him so much, right? Because it was like there were a lot of things that were happening in this society that I didn't agree with, but I was made to feel bad for not agreeing with them. And then when Jordan Peterson just came and put into words what I was thinking, it was just incredible, right? So you had sort of this timeline where you had people like Jordan Peterson come along, right? And you've had your Joe Rogans, your David Goggins, you've had all these self-improvement people come along. Then 2021, you had Hamza bust on the scene, right? And he came on and he gave like young men he gave them this confidence, be like, get onto self-improvement, meditate, journal, whatever it was, right? But like a lot of these people a lot of people I've mentioned have not been like very open about like their faith. A lot of them aren't really like Christian people, right? Except maybe like David Goggins has mentioned like how he's Christian like a couple of times. But in general, their general message wasn't Christian centered, right? Then obviously 2022 you had Andrew Tate burst on the scene, and he is definitely not somebody who's pushing like Christian values, right? But it started there. It really started there with young men who just felt like, no, I don't want what this life has to offer. And I think what I'm realizing is there are a lot of young people who, they want to get to know God. They want to live a life, the life that God promised. They want to follow what God said, not what this world is offering, because they see that it's leading to destruction. It's not a life well lived. It's just, we just don't want that. And I don't know about you, but that was very encouraging for me because I've always been like one of those kids, right? I was one of those people. And now I'm just seeing this happening, and it's just really, really encouraging, right? So if you're one of those people that are watching this video, it's like props to you, right? And you've come to the right place. You're looking for the light, right? The only way you should be looking, the only place you should be looking is God, right? Not looking to this world. And I'm glad that we're here having this conversation. So, speaking about like keeping your mind on God and giving your life to God and everything, it sounds great in practice. It sounds straightforward, right? But then if you're actually someone who wants to live that out, you want to put that in practice, right? And not just be a lukewarm Christian who's kind of you're kind of living, and this is kind of something I've been seeing. I don't know if it annoys you, but it kind of annoyed me as someone who's like, I don't say hardcore Christian, but like I'm trying to find a better way of wording that. But technically, I'm like a hardcore Christian, right? Like I'm someone who really believes in Christian values, right? As someone who really, really, really and truly believes in Christian values, seeing people come like your Andrew Tates, your Hamzas, and all of them, it's kind of like it's kind of encouraging because like they're trying to lead men down the right path. But then when you see that they're lacking that biblical masculinity, that Christian faith, right? It kind of frustrates you a little bit. It's like, why does no one like first of all, why does no one like respect Christianity? But secondly, like, why aren't there like Christian masculine leaders who are like leading the front? Because that's the only way, right? Like we're only men. Like I'm sure you've seen like people who watch Hamza closely. I'm sure like you've seen like the criticism he's been getting recently or whatever it was, right? He he's been like flip-flopping, and like there's some like degeneracy in like what he teaches. I'm sure you've definitely seen it in like Andrew Tate, where it's very degenerate, right? And you're kind of like, but you're just missing the mark a bit, right? And as men, we're supposed to be, like I said, as men, we just men, right? We're gonna get things wrong, and I think if we are biblically led, then that definitely helps keep us and the people who are following us on the straight and narrow path, right? And we can keep each other accountable by the teachings of the Bible, because that's the only correct way to live life, right? Like it's the only, those are the only instructions we truly need. And I think what this generation needs is we've got like the first part correct, right? Like where you've got like young men who are like men who are just leading, who are leading young men, like being like, no, stop, don't follow what this world has to offer, like follow like self improvement and everything. But we need leaders like that who are Christian, like who are Bible led. And again, as I said, if you're watching this video, you've come to the right place. So now we need to speak about like the practicality of actually giving your life to God. What does that look like? If you don't want to just be a lukewarm Christian who's kind of like you're on self-improvement and you sort of like sprinkle God into your life, you find time to add God into your life, but you truly want to give your life up to God, right? You want to do what Matthew said, where it's you seek first the kingdom of God and everything else shall be added to you. You want to do that, but then when you actually get into putting it into practice, it's difficult, right? Paul says in Romans, I forgot which one it is, I think it's Romans 8. I'm not sure. It's somewhere in Romans. Somewhere in Romans where Paul says, I do the things that I don't want to do, and the things that I want to do, the things I should do, I don't do. I feel like that's something a lot of us really resonate with. And funnily enough, that's like I mean, I have a podcast with my friend called the Jesus Convo Pod, where we speak mainly just like from a biblical point of view, right? And that's an episode I think it should probably be coming out the same week like this video comes out, so you can go watch that. But either way, like that depicts just how difficult it is. Like Paul, he knew like Romans, and that's what I'm going to speak about in this video, right? Like Romans is fantastic. I think the reason I've been finding it so fantastic is that it was written to the Romans, and Rome in that time was basically like the West. It was the West, basically. It was the Western world, right? It was filled with like the Gentiles, right? Because in the Bible, you have the Jews and the Gentiles. The Jews are like God's chosen people. They're the people who've been brought up on the Bible, right? And then the Gentiles are basically everyone else, right? Like the rest of the world. And the Romans, Rome was like, it was the West. It was very degenerate. It was also very advanced, like, but it was godless. And that's the kind of like the world we're living in now, right? And Paul wrote this letter to the Romans, right? It's 16 chapters, but I think I just read the 16th chapter last night. That was more of like just, like just greeting. But like the core is like 15. Paul wrote 15 chapters, and those chapters are gold. If you take anything away from this video, I say go and read that. Go and read that book. But don't do what I did, right? Because this is what I did when I first read Romans. I think it was probably in like early March, I finished reading Romans, right? 15 chapters. I was doing this thing where it's like, I'm trying to build a routine, and I'm trying to like fit God into the routine, because it was the only way I knew how, right? And I'm sure if you're trying to get closer to God, it's probably the only way you've kind of like looked at doing it, right? You've kind of looked at like, you've looked at it from the lens of self-improvement, where you sort of add things in and you try to make it a habit and you consistently grow it over time. And I don't think there's anything like wrong with that. I think if you're trying to build your faith, there's no like wrong way, right? But then as we do in self-improvement, you need to keep improving, right? You need to keep changing the way you look at things, right? Because I've gone a long time where I've just I just read my Bible for 5 minutes every day, and I just aim to do that. And I haven't kept like a 365-day streak, because things happen. But like me, we don't really care too much about streaks. We care about like the effective workload you're doing over a long period of time. And again, for me, in terms of like my consistency in reading the Bible, I've been pretty good over the last like year or two. But my issue, and I think that's where your issue would come in, and a lot of people who are like, you're seeking God but you're struggling really to like completely give your life to God, is that you kind of just read for the sake of reading, kind of like in self-improvement, where you just do something for the sake of doing it. And I actually made a video, I think probably last week or the week before, about how we've hit like, when you're doing self-improvement for a certain period of time, you're going to hit a level where now the things you're doing, the old things you're doing just aren't cutting it anymore, right? It's not just cutting it to just, trying like go to the gym consistently like three times a week, right? And you're kind of just going there doing whatever, and you're kind of just eating whatever. Like you're not very consistent on your business. Like same thing. It's just not cutting it, because now you actually want to jump to the next level. You want to get to a level where it's like life changing, right? You don't just want to get to a point. And I'm using gym as an example because it's the easiest one to use, right? Like you've gotten to a point where now you don't just want to have, I have a little bit more muscle, and I have like a lost like a little bit more fat. Like now I want to get to a point where I have a 10 out of 10 physique, right? Like to get to that level, like things need to change, and it's not just I'm just waking up and I'm just doing this, right? It's now I need to change my mentality, because now I need to be very consistent. I can't afford to have 3 week periods where I've kind of like lost some weight here, and then I've put back on weight because I've had like a week and a half where I've just been eating like trash. You can't afford to be doing that anymore. And I think that just applies also in just the rest of your life, right? Like you've gotten to a point now, I know for me, I've gotten to a point now where like something like this YouTube channel, for example, like I want to take this far. Like I really want to build like a community of like young, like-minded Christian men who are self-improvement, right? And we're like building through life together. I really want to build like a YouTube channel like that. And again, to the things I'm speaking about, I have a TikTok and like an Instagram account where I was making reels and TikToks, and it blew up. I got like hundreds of thousands of followers and stuff, and did that in like 2022. But now I'm on YouTube, right? And now I'm trying to really build like a long-lasting, a very potent like brotherhood. Like I'm trying to build a brotherhood. I'm not just trying to gain followers now. And on YouTube, anyone who knows, it's a whole different ball game, right? Like sitting down here and making these videos, getting people to sit down and watch, you really need to think. Like you need to think about who you're trying to reach, right? What value are you adding to their life, right? How can you improve your videos? And you need to be very consistent, right? It's not just like with YouTube and TikTok where you kind of just posting, you're just copying what's going viral, and you're putting your own like video behind it. You're putting your own spin on the content, and you blow up, right? And you just need some consistency to follow a formula, and you're done. Like this is deliberate, and you really want to take it to the next level. And in your life, you have things, and you will hit a point in your self-improvement where you're like, oh, okay, it's cool, I've made some improvement, but now I actually want to get to a point where my life is changing, and you need to hit that next level. So to take it back to the topic at hand, in case you thought I was kind of just veering away to just talk about my life, I had a point I'm trying to make with that, is that like, in your spiritual journey, if you're really trying to grow, and again, it's been very similar for me, if you're really trying to grow, you're going to hit a point where now you need to jump to that next level, right? It's not just enough for me to just go about living my own life and then, I've got 5 minutes for God at the end of the day. That's not going to cut it anymore. Now I truly want to give my life to God. Now, when you want to do that, you'll figure out just how difficult it is, because the first thing you come across, the first glaring mistake, or not mistake, the first glaring problem that you'll come across is the one that I think a lot of Christians just struggle with, and most of us just don't really deal with it. We kind of just, like I said, if you're living a lukewarm Christian life, you'll kind of just carry on with your life. But the first problem you'll come across, and it's a big problem, right, is what you want in your life and what God's will for your life is. Those two, they're difficult. They're difficult to calibrate. Now, if what you want and what God wants for you are aligned, happy days, right? Like things are going to go well for you. But I think for most of us, that's usually not the case, because a lot of our desires they've been molded. They've been molded and shaped, as I said earlier on, about like the way the men's self-improvement space has grown, right? If you're a young man that was trying to improve your life, you've probably like you've probably even dipped for a while. You dip your feet in like the red pill space, right? And again, as I was saying, like, those are very degenerate, but like, it's like there weren't really many other leaders, so you'd watch like the red pill guys. But like, a lot of our desires are led by the world. And when you're now trying to give your life to God, and you're trying to be like, okay, God, I want like, okay, first of all, you learn that like God is not a genie, right? You're not just going to be like, oh, this is the life I've concocted for myself in my head. I want this, right? So God, give this to me, right? In basically, in those words, like effectively, that's what like a lot of people's relationship, right? The relationship with God is like, oh, I want this, give this to me. And then when God doesn't give it to you, you kind of get mad, and then that's when like your faith kind of stalls. But if you're someone who's truly trying to give your life to God, you know deep in your heart of hearts, right, that you're gonna have to submit your will to God, right? You're gonna have to submit to God's will, right? Because logically, if you think about it, right, of course, right, of course, God's will is best for me, because He's God, right? He knows what He's doing, right? I don't. I'm simply a human, right? But again, we go back to what Paul said in Romans, where he says, I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things that I do want to do, right? It's like I've had it myself, like for the last couple of months. I don't know how long actually, probably even the last year or so. I've always just prayed, like within my prayers, I've always included, like, can you, God, please make it so that my heart's desires align with your will for me, right? Because I want that. But again, I'll pray that prayer, and then when the week starts, like I'll just go back to living my life, chasing the things that I want, right? And it's like, how do we bridge that gap? How do we bridge that gap between like what I want and what God's will for me is, right? Because obviously we need to bridge that gap somehow. And again, the answer always goes back, and I think you would probably find this as a theme in all of the topics we speak about in relation to just our relationship with God, is that you need to read your Bible. And I spoke earlier about how I was reading the Bible like 5 minutes a day, right? Like just for the sake of reading it. And I was kind of just reading a chapter, kind of taking in what I can. But no, you don't just need to read your Bible. You need to study it. It's the book of life. You're trying to get God. You're trying to give up your life to God, right? You're trying to find out what God's will for you is. And the way you find out God's will for you and how that's separate from the dreams that you have concocted because of what this world is giving you, how you distinguish the voices in your head from being the ones that are like off this world and those of the Holy Spirit, is you need to spend time with God. You need to get to know God properly. You need to spend time in the Word, right? And you need to not just read the Bible, you need to study it. So I was telling the story of what happened with me when I was reading Romans, right? So I just read it for the sake of, like, I was just reading, just be like, oh, Romans seems like a pretty good book, let me read it, right? And I did the chapter a day thing. I'd spend like 5 minutes, I'll go onto the Bible app, and I wouldn't even like read, I'd put like the audio, and that's how I still do it, but now I'm trying to like study it more. But I put the audio, and I put it on 2x speed, and you can kind of just hear what's being said, right? And I can kind of follow when that happens. But the issue is like, you shouldn't just be reading for the sake of reading. Because what happened with me was, I finished Romans, right? I finished it, like I said, it's 16 chapters in total, 15 like meaty chapters, right? Where there's like things to learn. I mean, even in the 16th one, I actually highlighted something there yesterday. So actually, all 16, there's something to learn from them. Like Romans is a good book, right? Every book in the Bible is a good book, right? But here we're speaking specifically about Romans, right? I read it and I finished it within like 2 weeks, and for me, I was like, Romans is very repetitive, right? It feels like it's just Paul saying that, like, oh, we will never be good enough to get to God, so that's why Jesus had to come and die for us, to bridge that gap, because we've fallen ever since Adam and Eve ate those apples in the garden. There's been this massive chasm between God and us, and we are just wretched human beings. We will never be good enough for God, and Jesus bridged that gap. That's what it felt like effectively that book was telling us. And that's not a trivial teaching, by the way. Like, that is massive. That is massive, right? If you're someone who's, like, again, you look at this world and you look at like your Tates and all of them saying, oh, come to Islam and all of that stuff, right? And it's like, that's the distinguishing factor between Christianity and like all the other religions. Even within like the Christian faith, when you look at like Catholics and Orthodoxy, and again, that's something we can get into on a different day, right? But like, the distinguishing factor between like Protestantism, right? Or if you're American, you'd say Protestant. I say Protestant, bro. I'm South African, okay? But like, if you look at the difference between Protestantism and then like all the other ones, is that it's all about our relationship with Jesus, and that's why like Jesus died for us, right? And that's, again, it's not a trivial teaching at all. But that's not all the book of Romans was about, because what happened in my story is that very week, like, I finished it. I think I probably would have finished it on like a Friday or something, right? The next Wednesday, I ended up going to this new church that I like so much. Like, there are a lot of like people my age. I went there for like a young adults connect group, right? And the teaching um, in the connect group. For those of you that don't know what connect groups are, it's basically like within the church, there will be like smaller groups that break up and then like they meet during the week. And this was like a young adults one, right? So you can just imagine in like a big church, right? There's like a young adults meet. Like this one was 18 to 24. It's like, oh, on Wednesday, if you guys are like on Wednesdays, if you guys are 18 to 24, like, oh, we're gonna meet here at this time, right? And just come. And all the like young adults, like you just sit down and you like it depends how the leader wants to take it, but you can like worship, you can like read the Bible. You not can. You're definitely gonna read the Bible, right? You're gonna discuss things, right? You can either discuss the message that the pastor preached on the Sunday, or there's like a specific reading that we have. So at that connect group, right, the teaching we had was Romans 12 verse 2, and I remember when I heard that I was like, okay, cool. I just finished reading Romans. This is awesome, right? Romans 12 verse 2. Do not conform your ways to this world, but be transformed through the renewing, but let God transform you through the renewing of your mind, so that you can see that so that you can see that his plans for you are perfect, right? Something along those lines. Okay, I haven't studied like it word for word, but I remember exactly what it is. Do not conform to the ways of this world, but let God transform you through the renewing of your mind, so that you can see that his plan for you is pleasing and perfect. There we go. I got it right. Yeah, so it was that verse, and I read it, and like, this is different because I'm not just reading a chapter, and I'm not just reading a chapter a day just to get through it, right? When you're reading a chapter a day just to get through it, it's, oh, don't conform your ways to this world. Let God transform you. Move on to the next verse, right? But now we were sitting in a connect group and we had time to discuss it. Now we didn't end up discussing too much of it because the conversation ended up leading elsewhere because people had like different things to add, and it was still like a good connect. But for me, I had time to sit down and look, because I remember what the youth pastor said. He said, you tell me what in that verse stands out to you. And for the first time in my life, I think, I actually studied a verse. Like, I actually had to break down a verse and look at every component of that verse and what that meant to me, right? What I could take away from that. And that is very different from the way we've read, right? I know this is kind of like contrary to what I was watching. Cliff Nettle and Stuart Nettle, they were on George Jacob's podcast, right? And one of the things I remember that Stuart said, right, that was so profound. I loved it. He said, like, one of his favorite sayings is that you shouldn't like read the Bible in verses. Stop reading verses, read passages. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that's how we should be doing. I think that's probably a big problem in Christianity, is that we have all these cute little verses, aesthetic verses we post, right? But again, I think in this case, like when you're trying to study, trying to get to know, you read like I've just explained to you like what the book of Romans is in a nutshell, right? It's about like your relationship with God, right? You read the passages in context, but within those passages, you need to study. You really need to study, right? So at this Young Adults Connect, I sat down and I really thought about like, oh, what stands out to you? And I remember reading that, and I was like, when you first read it, it's just don't conform your ways to this world, but let God transform you. But for me, like, what stood out to me was, but let God transform you through the renewing of your mind, right? And in my head, I was like, that is so much more difficult than we just think it is. Let God transform you. Because what does letting God transform you entail? It entails you surrendering to his will and letting him literally transform you through the renewing of your mind. Now, if you ever tried to renew your mind, you know how difficult that is, right? If you've ever gone through like a mental slump, and you're trying to like renew your mind, you know just how difficult that is, right? So for me, I was like, that's difficult. How do I do that, right? But let God transform you through the renewing of your mind. And the answer was literally in the next line, so that you will know that God's will for you is pleasing and perfect, right? Now, how's that an answer to my question? Now, I remembered I watched one of George Janko's podcasts as well, and there was something I learned really, really well. I think it was a clip as well, something that just stuck with me, where he said that like we need to humble ourselves under God, right? It says it in James, humble yourself under God, right? That's basic, humble yourself under God, but it's like, no, humble yourself under God. Are you humbling yourself under God, right? I tie it back with Romans 12 verse 2, right? So that you will know that his plan for you is pleasing and perfect. Now, we know that he's God. He knows more than us. He knows more than we ever will, right? But then when we think about it, if you were to think about it, I remember when I was young, I felt so bad making this prayer, bro, but I made it, right? I was like, God, please don't let me be like a pastor when I grow up, right? Because I was like, I have this life I want to live. I want to be like a football player. I want to be an athlete, right? I want to live like this fun life. I don't want to just be like a monk, um, or like a monk pastor or something like that. I don't want to be any of that, right? And it's like, it's a funny story to tell now, but like we still do it as adults, right? It's kind of like, okay, God, I'll surrender to your will, but let me like have this, like, let it be like this, please. Like I have this particular vision for my life, and it's like God's will for you is pleasing and perfect. For me, it got tied in really well when I also went to a connect group. I think it was probably I forgot when. Around that time, I went to another connect group, but this one was like with older people, and this guy was telling the story about how his daughter had cancer, right? Like he was an older guy, like the couple probably like in their late 50s, right? And they're telling the story of how their daughter had cancer. And long story short, the doctors they couldn't figure out a way to help her. And one day she just woke up and was all like gone, right? And all the doctors and everyone who ever met her was saying, "You're a walking miracle," right? And what that guy said, I remember what he said is that like God knows the end at the beginning, right? He knows the story at the end. If us humans had it our way in that story, she never would have had cancer. And that's a whole different story, that's a whole different conversation about, like atheists. They're like, oh, how can God exist if like bad things happen? Which is very stupid. But again, whole different conversation. But in this case, right, if we had it our way, she never would have had cancer, right? But again, we're here for God's glory, not our own. And that story is going to be used for God's glory. People's lives are going to be changed because of that story. My life could potentially be changed. Well, it will be changed, potentially because in part to do with that, right? I'm sharing this story with you, and whoever else is watching this, lives are being changed, right? It's for God's glory. God used her for God's glory, right? And as I said, if we had it our way, she never would have had cancer. But then the story wouldn't be here. God knows the end at the beginning. So he like I said, his will is pleasing and perfect. Not like I said, like Paul said. Okay, it's there in the Bible, right? God's will is pleasing and perfect. I think we can all agree on that. But we don't live it out because it's so difficult. It's like, no, but I want it this way. Please, God. Like, I understand. Like, I understand you have a will for me and everything, but I want this. Can't you like meet halfway or something like that? It's like, no. God's will is pleasing and perfect. He knows the end at the beginning, right? At the end, you will look back and you'll be like, now I see what you meant, God, right? And that ties in with humbling yourself under God, right? The way you surrender your will to God is that you humble yourself. You realize that like everything you've ever had in your life, everything good that's ever happened in your life, everything that's ever happened in your life, period. Everything you have, everything you're proud of, which is another reason why we shouldn't have pride. We shouldn't be proud of anything, right? Everything, right, is all because of God. It's all because God allows it, right? There's nothing you've done in essence that has been because of you, right? Even something as fundamental as I study for a test and I write the test, I get a good mark for the test, right? We take that for granted and you're like, oh, well, of course I passed. Of course I got a good mark. I studied. It's like, no, right? You study, I mean, we can go back to things like, oh, you're alive because of God, you're able to like get this book to study because of God, but I want to talk about like the practical things that would apply to our lives, right? You've taken for granted the fact that you sit down, you study content that you were told to study, and you go in the exam, you get asked questions on that content, questions that you understand. You wrote down the question, you wrote down the answer that they want, and you got the mark, right, that you deserved, right? You take that for granted. You take it for granted because you could have studied, right? You could have studied hard, right? And that test could have been a ridiculous test, right? Like that day, the questions were just really difficult. Like they were testing like proper in-depth knowledge that you hadn't studied to that level before. Like you couldn't have studied to that level before. Or they tested like a section that you were really weak in, and that made up like a lot of the marks, right? Or you could have been like dyslexic. Now I'm dyslexic because I can't say that word, right? No, you could have been like dyslexic, right? You could have gone blank. You know how easy it is for you to go blank after you studied for an exam and then you see an exam and you just panic and you go blank. You could have gone blank. Things like that could have happened and then you wouldn't have passed the test. But you did pass the test. And it's just things like that where you just realize that, like, oh, yeah, that's not me, it's God, right? And that's what James means when he says, humble yourself under God, right? That's why pride is a sin, right? Pride is a sin because we're saying, oh, I'm doing this because of me, right? And God is like, no, 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 no. There's nothing you can do without me. And that ties in very well with what I was speaking about earlier in terms of like how Christianity is just set apart from all the other religions, right? Because a lot of other religions, you look at like Islam, like Judaism, even like this way kind of my problem comes in with sort of like orthodoxy and like um, Catholicism and like all other religions, right? Is that there's this emphasis on I can do certain things to get myself right with God. And that's in complete contrast to what we're taught in the New Testament, what we're taught particularly in Romans, which is that, as I said, right? Not as I said about what Paul said, right? I don't want to take, credit for what he said, right? We will never, ever, ever reach God's level. There will always be a chasm, or there will always going to be a chasm between us and God. No matter what we do, we're wretched sinners. We'll never get to God's level. We'll never please God in that way, right? That's why Jesus had to die to bridge the gap for us. Because, and I think this is in Romans, either Romans or James. It has to be Romans. It has to be Romans, right? But yeah, it was saying that like, because if we believe that you could go make certain sacrifices and you could do things to get yourself right with God, then it would have been you who did it to get yourself right with God, right? And no, we can never get there. And now it will always be because of God's grace, right? That Jesus came and died for our sins, and that bridge is closed. That gap is closed, right? We go to heaven because of God's grace, not because of what we did. And that's where the humility part comes in. And I think just going back to the topic at hand, I've been all over the place in this video, but I've got into the destination eventually, right? Like I think this conversation is just a very good one to be having, right? The way you humble yourself under God, the way you the way you let God transform you through the renewing of your mind, right? So you'll know that His will is pleasing and perfect, as it says in Romans 12 verse 2, is that you need to humble yourself and just realize how great God is. And the way you do that, right, in a way that is actually effective, not just, oh yeah, God is great, right? But like the way you actually live that out, it's just realizing everything. I want you to just start doing this exercise. Everything you do, just think about it. It wouldn't be possible without God at all. And I don't just mean like the generic, oh, I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for God. I wouldn't have this chair if it wasn't for God. I just mean in general. Right? Like the things we take for granted, right? The things we actually place value on, right? Like true value. And like the fact that you're able to sit here and watch this video, right? The fact that I'm able to sit here and record this video, just things like that. It's like, that's because of God's grace, right? It's because of God's grace that I'm able to make this video, that I've had access to the Bible, right? That I'm able to think about these things, right? Because again, I could have very, very easily been led down a different path. Now, again, the life I grew up in, like I grew up in like you're probably like me, I'm guessing, right? Like I grew up in like the suburbs, my parents protected me. Like I never did like drugs or anything like that. Like I was just a good little boy going to school. I didn't even go out that much. Like I was kept like away from that stuff. But again, like I was on TikTok, I'm on the internet. Like I could have easily been led astray. I could have easily been believing that crap that the liberals push and all that stuff, right? Like, but I didn't. I'm here, right? And so are you. And I think that there's just things we should be grateful for. But yeah, I think I can go on and on and on about this topic. But you guys let me know what you guys think of the topic in the comment section below. Make sure you subscribe to join the Self-Improvement Brotherhood. And until next time, I'll see you boys.